Everybody take a deep breath, all together. And we're gonna laugh, right? It's been a heavy day, but it's really powerful to see everybody coming together here. Is the mic on? I believe it is. Let me take my mic. Is this better? Yeah. So today's panel is looking at trans labor practices. We have some incredible panelists with us here today, including social justice activists and artists, to talk about trans inclusion and best practices for transgender folks in the workplace. And as we're witnessing so many restrictive laws being passed, so many hateful laws, so much violence in this country, this conversation is even more important to have right now. So we're very lucky to have with us this afternoon Whit Guerrero. Kenya Boudreaux. Marcel? And is Star right here? Oh, that's right. Okay, perfect. And then okay, I'm the last minute person jumping up here, so I apologize for my disorganization. But yes, so we're here to talk about trans inclusion and best practices for transgender folks in the workplace. Quick bios on everybody. Marcel is a trans visual artist, educator, and curator who explores the relationship between queer and trans kinship through photographs, installations, and public programming. Whit is a facilitator, mediator, and housing justice advocate. Born, like, okay, perfect. We're gonna here.
We can start it.
Okay, I've started the introduction, so let me finish here. So, Star is a writer, composer, and director who released music under the moniker of Amerasu.
Yeah, you can start there.
Okay. And then Kenya is an accomplished engineer at Apple and dedicated activist for transgender and radical justice. So please welcome everybody.
Right. Hi everyone. How's it going? Hi. It's good to see all of you. Thank you for taking time today. I know that the world is in a very violent, awful place. And I know that there was a protest today and there was a panel about Palestine right before this one. So I really want to appreciate everyone for coming here, making space for this, which is also simultaneously sort of happening because all struggles are intertwined. I'm so happy to finally be putting this together because I love these three folks so much. I love you, Kenya, I love you, Star, I love you, Whit. All of the work that you guys have been doing for so long has really inspired me, and one of the things that really inspired this talk was thinking about how trans people experience a lot of discrimination in employment, and a lot of that comes from ignorance. And I said, and we generally said to people, like, people should just go educate themselves, and that's true. But I'm gonna be that person today for a little bit that was like, you know what, let's just tell people how to be better. Let's just spell it out so that we can actually move forward and implement practices so that workplaces are safer and more inclusive for all of us. So before we start, I want to show you like a couple of things so that we are grounded into this conversation, and then we can go into more of a personal experience and sharing moment. So this is us looking very cute. So these are some facts that I'm going to share from the 2015 Transgender Survey and from the 2022 US Trans Survey. And I also wanted to put this, to share this with people who are not familiar. So we are in a moment where there are a lot of anti-trans bills being introduced in the United States. And it's very wild to see this map if you haven't already, because you see how many states are introducing some of these bills, how many of them are active, So right now we're looking at 492 active bills all around the states. So we're in a very violent time where trans lives are being politicized like very heavily. And I just want to share some of these statistics so you understand sort of like the gravity and relevance of what we're going to be talking about today. So nearly half of the respondents to the survey have thought about moving to another state because their state government considered or passed laws that target transgender people from unequal treatment. So that's wild. Like 50% of people are considering moving out of their homes because they don't feel safe. These are some of the top states where people are considering moving from. And this of course includes people who are like younger, their whole families are considering moving, but also trans adults. I want to include this one because it makes me feel very hopeful. This is sort of like the age gap of everyone who participated in the survey. And so what we can see is that people who are between 18 and 24, 40% of these people are trans or non-binary. So we're seeing that Gen Zers are actually like much more like gender variant than any other generation. In this way, it kind of makes me feel optimistic because everything that we're gonna be learning today will be applied to the youth. Then it gets really sad, but hold tight. So this is just some facts of like 1/3 of the respondents were experiencing poverty. Nearly 1/3 have experienced homelessness at some point in their lifetime. Some people, 30% have said that they were verbally harassed in the last 12 months because of their gender identity. 39% said that they were harassed online in the last 12 months. This was talking about how more than 3/4 of adult respondents, so 80%, and nearly 2/3 of 16 and 17-year-olds experience verbal harassment, physical attacks, online bullying, etc. And then how their teachers or staff refuse to use chosen names or pronouns, and they're being denied the use of restrooms or locker rooms matching their gender identity. And we know that Next Benedict was recently a victim of this. So this is something that is like actually having real consequences. But despite all of those things, right, like this is all really like bad news, but despite all of that, 94% of everyone who was interviewed said that changing their gender identity actually, they reported that they were like much more satisfied with their life. So that's just to say that that's not really like an option for people to choose to be trans, right? Like this is just like a life-saving thing for all of us. But then this was really interesting, we were all talking about this, because it said that the transgender community in general is more educated than the general population. So 14% of the general population has not completed high school, 3% of the transgender community has not completed high school, 46% of the general population has completed some college degree, and then 65% of the transgender community has completed some college degree. And so, I want to say this, which is that these numbers indicate that the members of the trans community are more likely to attend college than general folks, but we are like 3 times more likely to be unemployed than members of the general population. So this is something that doesn't actually make sense, because trans people tend to be more highly educated, but we're 3 times more likely to be unemployed. And that's something that we're sort of thinking about today. So I'll just kind of skip to this. Okay, so this is now kind of going into trans labor specifically. So 49% of the people who were interviewed in this survey say that they're not out as transgender to any of their bosses or supervisors, and 42 of those who were surveyed report that none of their coworkers know that they're transgender. And that's sort of wild, but also you can see that it's out of a place of conceiving your own safety, right? And then I think this statistic to me really like, it hits close to home, but that's why we're here, right? So 67% of transgender individuals who held or applied for a job reported that they were not hired or promoted or were fired or forced to resign. And most of them was because of their gender identity. So those are all very intense things to hear, so I'm just gonna let you sort of like grasp that. But I think that so many of these things can actually be changed by providing information so that people can better show up for the trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming community. So now we're gonna talk a little bit more, and I really wanted the four of us to be gathering here because all of you have experienced the workplace in so many different ways, and I really, I love your bios because I was just like, wow, you have done so many things, but I wonder if you can just tell us in your own words, like, who are you and how did you get here, and maybe some things that you've done. Yeah.
Okay.
You want to start?
Yeah. Hi everybody, my name is Boudreaux. I am an engineer, I'm a software engineer at Apple. I'm also the executive director of the Transgender Education Foundation, a nonprofit that I had started back in 2020. And we provide scholarships to trans students who are trying to go to college, so that way we can retain them and give them life-saving access. How did I get here? I moved to San Francisco 10 years ago from Los Angeles to attend college, and I've stayed ever since. Working in the tech industry, this is also kind of where all of it is centered. And so I started off as a trans teen. I started transitioning back in high school, which is another experience of itself, and very different back in 2012. And I've been openly trans and visibly trans my entire adulthood and late teenage life. So yeah, I have a lot of experience with, I guess, economic discrimination and such, but I also have tons of stories of trans joy and achievement. So yeah, that's me.
I'm Star Amerasu. I also moved to the Bay, I guess it was 2011, so what year is it? 13 years ago? And I left for a bit, but I'm a musician first. That was my first job. And I think there was a group of artists here who were doing artwork, and I got into the queer arts festival circuit of creation. And so then my first professional job was creating a soundtrack to a film called Major, which was about Miss Major's life. She's a revolutionary activist who started a nonprofit called TGIJP. And so I also work at TGIJP now, doing digital media for them, and I'm in film school, and I create art here. I also DJ, so I have all these multiple different art practices, but primarily I would call myself an artist.
Hey everybody, so similar story, we all seem to have this in common. I came out a little bit later as trans. I tried to come out younger, but I didn't have the support. So I moved here in 2014. I was 24, and to pursue my transition, because San Francisco, from Canada specifically. I was born in Mexico, so this was my second time immigrating. And didn't have a work permit, so was undocumented. Had to like a lot of trans people, you had to survive doing sex work and working in the weed industry, all of that. And then in 2019, I got my green card, and from there, I went directly to working in a shelter. So I had a personal passion since I had experienced homelessness to help folks, and I loved working in the shelters. I really loved the unhoused community. But in 2020, during the pandemic, lost a person that I got really close to that was a 23-year-old non-binary trans femme person, and that really propelled me to understand that this youth fell through every single crack because there wasn't an environment to support their authenticity and their ability to express their gender. And that led me to kind of understand that the shelters were not hospitable for trans folks, and trans folks were actually rather sleep in the street than access shelter and case management. So trans people have just been really left behind and betrayed by the housing system and social services. So the opportunity came in 2021 to open the first trans-specific navigation center and shelter. So I led that initiative, and now it exists in the SOMA. It's called the Taman Bhutan Navigation Center, which I named after my friend that I lost in 2020. So I feel really, really proud of that achievement. It came with a lot of challenges. We employed over 25 to 50 trans and gender non-conforming people. was not a good experience for a lot of us, and that's when here to kind of share from my experience. And then I just got really fortunate that I met some really amazing allies that from that kind of bad experience took me in and kind of saw my professional skill set, and I now work in philanthropy with grantees that provide services to unhoused youth, and then I do some consulting on the side for Transgender Strategy Center that is creating a lot of like innovative programming to address a lot of the barriers trans people face in employment. So I'm really, really blessed to be able to be focusing my work now on that. So.
Yes, no, thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like all of you have worked in so many different realms, and maybe one way to start it, and I think that all of us have also experienced discrimination in many different ways, but I think to just start a conversation, maybe we can think about just, what are some basic elements that people can include in their workplaces to make it safer or more inclusive for trans people. And this is like level 1 things you can do to make your workplace more inclusive for wonderful trans people.
Okay, then I'll take it. A few things that you can do to make your workplace more trans inclusive. I think the first thing would be to introduce a culture of acceptance. So being open with your own gender pronouns and showing and demonstrating that you have knowledge about the topic, that you're receptive to different pronouns such as non-binary they/them pronouns, or alternative pronouns like ze and zer and such. So creating that culture first where people are able to share more about themselves and be more vulnerable and authentic in the workplace, I think is the first step. Taking charge to celebrate large community milestones such as Pride, such as Transgender History Month, which we now have in California, which is great, it's every August. And let's see, what else? The third thing I think would be to invite other people to gather and to celebrate or to mourn together. There are a lot of tragedies that happen in the transgender community, and some of the most impactful things that happened for me were on the interpersonal level, where my manager came up and said, hey, I saw this thing in the news, they're really attacking you and your community, this seems like it was relevant, like to you specifically, do you want to take the day off, or do you want to talk about it, do you want to access other kind of mental health resources? I think that those are very small things that you can do as an individual to impact your workplace and make it more trans-friendly.
And also with what you're saying with pronouns, it's also thinking about, your email signature, your Zoom, like all of this very specific ways, like everyone sharing that information so that we don't have to come forward first, right?
Something that I was thinking about the other day was what experience looks like for people who perhaps, like we were saying, is educated but aren't getting jobs, but they might be organizing events, or they might be organizing community spaces for their community. That's a lot of experience doing task management, that's time management, that's managing people, paying out people, that can be like payroll. These are all different experiences that people might have and skills that they have that don't necessarily translate to a 9-to-5 job, but when they are applying for 9-to-5 jobs, fall under a lot of different job categories. And so sometimes people don't necessarily have the language to articulate their experiences in a way that makes sense for a regular job. But I think being able to understand that somebody's experiences do translate to the work. And if you're a person who's hiring people who are trans and they're coming from where they might have been a sex worker, or they might have done all this different type of work, that they actually do have skills that translate to the workplace, and being receptive to other alternative forms of education. I think that's really important because not everyone is able to access all of these different ways that are conventional in our society. And so being open and receptive to people who are smart and bright and talented and who really want to work and have tenacity, that's just across the board. Like, trans people are often wanting these jobs and wanting to be in these spaces, and that should be enough to want to put them in there and giving them some grace for maybe not necessarily having the correct way that we view it in our society. That's something that I thought about.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like there is this idea of also, how do we make job descriptions more inclusive and approachable, right? So like, instead of being like, okay, you went to this school, you can be like, okay, you have 5 years of experience doing this type of like organizing, right? So what are kind of like equivalent, experiences that kind of can contribute to that? And I think job descriptions are actually like the first barrier to employment, right? So how do you sort of change that to make it so that different types of people can access the job market, but also those people have a different type of knowledge that will enrich whatever organization, company, industry you're in, right? So they're bringing actually something sometimes even more valuable sometimes, right?
Yeah, we're awesome. Hire us. Yeah, I'm like, oh, there's so much I want to say. Okay, well, the thing that first comes to mind is, from my experience, I do not believe that unless, and I'm going to talk about the nonprofit sector because that's where a lot of us end up, unless a nonprofit is started by trans people, it is set up specifically to be exclusionary and disempowering of trans people, period. Like, LGBT organizations have historically tacked the T on the end, had LGB-led organization, and then they, at the bottom, hire trans folks to do direct services. Meanwhile, they don't put trans people on their boards, and I think that this is a really huge issue that really is not inclusion, it's tokenization. And I've experienced that. It's extremely traumatic for a lot of us. So I think what people can do to make their workplaces more inclusive is to identify that if that is the structure of an organization that you work with, to like have our backs and say something and say, this is tokenizing unless we actually have trans people in positions of power within the organization. That's just the truth. There's no reason, and it's beyond that. Like I think that a lot of LGBT organizations are getting grants that should be given to trans-led organizations because they have the visibility, they have the years of, I remember I went to do ad back season to get funding from the city, and they were like, well, it's just that these LGBT organizations, they're gonna get the money because they've been around longer. And I was like, okay, and I went and got one of my elders who's like in her 60s, and I was like, to the politician, I was like, we've been here. Just because we didn't have access doesn't mean that we're new. And that should not be a reason to withhold us having the resources that we need. So I think that we are at a crux of trans people having resources through social services that is new-ish. And there's a lot of things that the entire system is going to have to restructure in order for us to actually succeed and experience equity. And I think that right now, unless we're starting our own organizations, I don't see equity. I see a lot of trans leaders, especially trans women of color, posting online about like the terrible experiences that they've had being forced to resign because of situations like this. So I think it's really important for allies to have our backs when they work with us in these settings and like really listen and really speak up and hold space. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's also, there's so many structural things that like institutions can sort of rethink about the way that they operate, right? And so even when you're thinking, okay, I should really hire more trans people in my workplace, and then also really taking the steps to be like, okay, how do I actually make the workplace a little bit safer or more inclusive, right? Like, do I have just, like all gender restrooms? Do they have, does the health insurance that we provide, does it cover gender affirming healthcare? Right, so sometimes even just hiring a trans consultant to do that work right before you actually hire trans employees is like an extra step that will actually retain employees long term. And then what you were saying too before, I mean, this is kind of like a little bit more subversive, but I really love this with, and I think Starry were also talking about this, of when we think about labor, like there's so many different types of labor that we're talking about, right? Like we're talking about hard skills, we're talking about soft skills. When I think about all the skills that a sex worker has, right? Like you're navigating systems that are not designed for you to be safe. And you're navigating those systems, you're making a livelihood, you're interacting with all sorts of people, and you're like bringing people joy. And I'm like, wow, imagine if like all the CEOs were like sex workers. Like we would be in a completely different world, right? It's a very different skill set that could actually be very transferable when you think about other types of jobs, right? So I'm also thinking about, let's talk about like different types of, like what does labor mean? And yeah, I think Star, you were thinking about sort of talking about that, and I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like when we were talking about this before, the idea of labor, because I feel like I brush against this a lot as someone who has made has made money doing just art only for like as my job for parts of my life, and then gotten like nonprofit jobs or worked in customer service and things. I think sometimes we separate the idea of like what could be work in our minds, but actually a lot of things are work, and to value them all the same would be like an equitable world, because if we're like, okay, this artist person's work is actually work, all the hours it takes for me to like think about what I'm gonna do, plan something that I'm gonna make, sit down, the practice that I put into it, like those are all like billable hours. And when I was really just only doing art, I would bill them as hours, especially when I would file my taxes. I'd be like, oh, this is like my hours working. And I think it's important to think about, when we think about the world as a global thing, that there's a lot of people whose work isn't necessarily the work that I might do, but it is work for them. And so I have to value that as well. And so if I was in a position of power in an organization, at a job or something, and I know that someone new is coming in, and I'm like, oh, they're doing this different type of work than me, I'm still gonna value their work and what they do, even if it's not necessarily what I do. And I think that can be difficult sometimes at first for people in different jobs to understand that other people might do different work than them. That was just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, I feel, Kenya, you were talking also about how a co-worker of yours wanted your input because, of course, now Gen Zers are more trans than ever. I don't know if you want to share that story, but it's stuck in my mind.
Yes, so what we were talking about was like my experience being a trans person in a corporate environment, and how there you have more of a rigid structure, like how Star was talking about, for what is expected, what your salary is for you to produce work. However, being a trans person often in an environment that may not have all of the support systems, and I work at Apple, which has a lot of support systems, but we still have to advocate for more. We do a lot of unpaid DEI work, leading coalitions for Pride, gathering people to celebrate things, to fundraise, to donate to charities, just to check in with one another. Also pushing for inclusive healthcare measures like family planning and hormone coverage. I've done so many things that I didn't consider myself qualified for, like selecting healthcare plans and options for millions of employees across multiple countries. Like what, And that was all unpaid work. And one of the biggest examples was something that happens where people expect, it's something you want to be participate with and you want to do, but they also kind of expect this unpaid work that they don't know that they're asking from you. So the example was, there's an Apple Pay senior executive who has a transgender child. And this child is now transitioning into, a beautiful young lady, and is 8 years old, and he wanted to reach out to the employee network of, prominent trans people to ask for advice, like what can I do to be more supportive of my daughter, and how can I support her and such. And so we went to lunch a couple times, and I'm offering different solutions, like, you should probably consider changing the school, or you may want to look at this summer camp, and there's tons of other trans kids that you can get connected with. Here are some nonprofits, here are some, basic 101 books for you to be up to date on the lingo, up to date on hormone guides and gender transition guides. And this whole time I'm talking, and I'm like a mid-level, well, actually I just got promoted to senior engineer, but now I'm a senior engineer, 5 years in my career. And he's a senior executive for a large division of our company. And not once has he paid for my lunch when I'm just divulging all this information. A $9 lunch, So I think that that's one of the examples of our labor is not taken into account, is expected to be given for free with no kind of transaction. So I'm catching him up on ways to parent his child, you know, and that he doesn't have to source from thousands of consultants who do this work and who bill it. And he's leveraging my life experience that I've collected over almost 30 years, well, you know, 15 years of being trans. So yeah, I think that that's one of those examples of like how when we show up, there are other forms of labor that we perform that are not valued or paid in that way.
Thank you. That made me think of a story I wanted to share too. So, having been a young employer of trans folks through the trans housing program that I was directing, some of my employees were my elders, and one person in particular that I work with who I just adore. She was like a super successful dancer in the 80s, and at the time she was really famous. And I think that a lot of our elders end up kind of having barriers to employment as they get older, because you can succeed in other kind of industries that sometimes our community ages out of. But I was super proud of her because after I left, she became the first trans woman to work for the Alameda County Public Defender's Office. So I'm super, proud to say that. And she just asked me, I guess they asked her if she would do a training for the department, and she was like, no, which is so inappropriate, And so she asked me if I would do it. And I did it, because I'm a trainer and facilitator, so I put together some slides and I went over and did it. But I did it for free for her, but most places would pay or hire a consultant to do that. And then one of my colleagues was like, okay, but next time, don't do it for free. But I think that I did it because that's she's my girl. So yeah, yeah, so just another example, a lot of these departments are still first, and these are city departments that are first to even hiring any of us. So they just really don't have the wherewithal to understand that they have to take on the responsibility of educating their staff, or paying somebody to, yeah.
Yeah, ultimately it's if you want to learn how to show up better, you can also pay those people to tell you how to do it. You won't just magically know how to do it, right? And I think, I'll speak for myself, I am also learning those things as I navigate my life after transitioning, right? And also, I've experienced moments where, I was applying for a job, I was applying for a promotion, and I had everything, and they were like, yeah, you're just overqualified, and then they just hired a mediocre white man, and it hurt me so much because I was like, how is this? How are people making decisions for me based on my qualifications, but also making decisions for them because they're like, well, it might actually be easier to just hire this person that we've been hiring always, right? But at the same time, I feel like we just can provide so many other types of initiatives. I know, Kenya, you've been also working at Apple, sort of introducing, some of the things that you were talking about. I don't know if there are other things that you wanted to share in terms of I know that there's a whole network of trans workers. I'm curious about your opinion with that.
Yeah, so even organizing or being part of the leadership team for the trans workers who are at Apple, we have about over 400 members. There are over 400 trans people working at Apple and being able to communicate with us and organize. And we had to bring that as a specific sub-organization that was away from the typical Pride at Apple LGBT organization, because we weren't able to really discuss freely about getting our needs met, or it wasn't really relevant to the greater conversation. So while I love my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, they probably don't have the answers for me as far as which hormone should I switch to, and how do I get a prior authorization for some kind of transition related expense that is medically necessary and is a benefit that I'm entitled to by working here and paying for my health insurance. So that has been something that comes with a lot of different challenges, where there's always a question of is this necessary? Do we need this? There may not be another model at another company where I have a friend, she's trans and she works at Applied Materials, and they're barely organizing their very first LGBT employee resource group. And you think about it, you're it's 2024, how are you barely organizing this? Versus, so in that sense, for the tech industry, our company does have some benefits of having an openly gay, CEO who also hasn't taken a stance to protect trans employers or trans employees or defend against, trans rights. It's kind of more of a quiet approach. So I think that that's part of the organizing that we want to do, is to be more vocal about getting our needs and our issues met, where so many people are making their voices heard about, repealing our rights.
I just really think about this thing about the burden of being this first person. And there's a particular personality type that all of us share, of being these people that are we're gonna get what we want, and telling people things. But I also think about there's so much of our community that isn't like that, and it takes so much for certain of us to be that person in the front, to be demanding, and it comes with this double-edged sword of exhaustion and tiredness, and that's also labor to think about. But something just to bring into the idea of we really have to, there's certain parts of our community that always have to be this first person. Oftentimes Black girls are the ones that really first are the ones to really open these doors for a lot of people, and so I just wanted to think about that and to voice that. There is a burden. I definitely feel it sometimes too, being okay, I'm gonna do this thing even though I know it's annoying, because I know that the next girl or the next person is gonna have an easier time than me, and it's fine. But I know that it is annoying.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And it just makes me think about a couple things. I think having been an employer a lot of young trans folks, early 20s, I don't know, I know it's Star Night shows, I don't know if you can relate, but I'm very fortunate that I was mentored into my work by Black trans elders. So they really kind of passed the torch of this kind of legacy of how trans people survived before we had access to nonprofit jobs and things like that. Miss Sharon Grayson is somebody, Janetta Johnson, and Kayan Dorosho, of all Black trans women that have a lot to do with why trans people have employment now, because of a legacy of getting jobs for people in HIV services back in the 80s and 90s. So I think that I noticed when I was employing a lot of young trans folks, and I was too young to be an elder, which is why I wasn't equipped for that role, but I just said, here's an opportunity to get people jobs that pay well, so I just went with it. But a big part of the reason that I think we struggled was because young trans folks, as much as they have this raw passion, and they're angry about the injustices that are happening, at the same time they didn't have relationships with their elders that kind of taught them that resiliency and that generosity to go out and do the work and be the first one. There was a lot of expectation, because I think personally a lot of young folks never had the experience of being well, we didn't have jobs before. You know what I mean? A lot of people have been born into trans people being visible in a certain way that I'm in my 30s and I didn't really see that. There was a period in which I didn't see that. It was very brief with my generation. But for younger folks than me, I think they didn't even really get a sense of that fight. And so a lot of I remember somebody I know was our elders had to physically fight. You know what I mean? So those of us that learned it from them, we still have that kind of drive, but I do see this kind of disconnect with some younger generations, where I want to find a way for us to connect them with that legacy and that resiliency, because we still have a lot of fighting to do, and especially with all the anti-trans legislation that's happening right now. So that's just what it made me think of, where you said the Black girls that are always the ones to be that comes from a certain way in which trans people have historically survived, and sisterhood and motherhood, and those of us who were fortunate enough to be brought in under our elders' wings. And the last thing I'll say is one thing that really hurts me is I hear a lot of young trans folks who have social media platforms and presences and things like that, and they're out here saying we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm yeah, they're still alive. Do you know them? Have you checked in on how they're doing? Because they're here. And I think that detachment to just be out here kind of benefiting from the rights that people had to physically fight for and go to jail for, and talk about it in this really detached way is a problem. So I want to encourage younger trans folks to know who your elders are, know where you came from, know where your rights came from, get involved, meet them. They want to know young folks, they want to have lunch with you. And because I reached out and like had lunch and got to know people's stories, I feel like that was what actually equipped me to be able to do some of these first things, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking back to, and some of you might know this, but I was showing it to my students recently where I was like, you know, we were talking about Stonewall, we were talking about the Compton cafeteria riots, and then we were looking at the video of Sylvia Rivera where she's like giving this speech and everyone's booing her. Like all these white people are booing her, and I know that she died being homeless, right? And so here's like someone, like a trans woman of color who sort of is like part of the gay liberation movement, who was like discriminated by the gay liberation movement, who died homeless. And I'm like, and then we're seeing this statistics, and I'm like, okay, this is still happening. And so I think that whenever I see an opportunity, I feel like I'm like, okay, every time I get access to something, I just can't think just about myself, right? Like I'm just like, okay, how do we like bring more people into this? How do we get more people paid? How can we just change the system a little bit? But I get what you're saying of also just being like, you know, to me, seeing so many of us here, I know that like it just feels so much better when we're doing it together. And at the same time, like one thing that I didn't mention is that people who are like not supported by their parents and their family are so much more likely to experience homelessness and unemployment. So when we're also talking about trans labor, like I just want to stress the importance of, you know, as an ally of having like a young trans person in your life, that showing up for them is actually like one of the most important things you can do for a trans person, right? Like just being supportive, like just being there, don't kicking them out of the house, right? Like all of these things that's how you show up for people. And yeah, we're sort of talking about those things, and that's just staying in my mind as a way of also being inspired by that work, right? Let me see, I had another question, I completely went into my own inspiration path. Oh, that's the other thing that we were talking about, just like maybe, you know, thinking about our mentors, maybe we can give a little shout out. I think that for me, someone who really made me think about labor differently was this person that I met in San Francisco, Stosh Fila, who's a trans masculine person who's in the arts. And when I met him, he was kind of just like, oh, I was a student and I was looking for jobs, and he was like, oh, I have a job for you. And it was one of the highest paying jobs that I ever had, which was like $32 an hour then. I was like, what, I'm rich. You know, that was many years ago, but also I was like, okay, and he was a trans person himself, and he just took me under his wing and just, you know, was there with me, was kind of like supportive in the job place, and I was like, wow, I've never felt so supported in a work environment, both because I'm being compensated fairly and because someone is showing up for me and just being like kind, right? And I had like horrible bosses before, and I think that moment to me was like, oh, I don't need to work with toxic people. And it makes such a difference with working with someone who is like, you know, taking care of their own turmoils, right? So I guess I'm just gonna say Stosh Fila is one of my mentors when I think about trans labor.
My first reaction to it was like, oh, I don't know if I have a lot of mentors who have ushered me into the tech space, but actually that's not true. In 2015, I met Dr. Courtney Ziegler, trans man, black trans man, and he hosted this hackathon for Black Trans Lives. It's in the Chronicles. If you search, Trans Hack Chronicle 2015, you'll see that there's also more to the story. So we basically were looking to put on this hackathon to build software tools to support the trans community. At the time, there were a lot of conversations about bathroom bans, and that was the first time the conversation had come up. So we started thinking about making a web app that could locate, all of the gender-neutral bathrooms in your area. And there have been many iterations of apps like that afterwards, but this was a think tank with trans people, some of them who had technology experience and other people who were allies who were coming together and saying what are the needs of the trans community and how do we use technology to leverage services that like nonprofits provide or that a consultant may be able to provide, but at scale and on demand. So that really inspired me to keep going and to see my growing skill set and career into being an engineer as being more something that is not separated from the trans community and the needs of my community, but actually really a way to support them and to, build something lasting besides just what I can do on my own. So that's been a really inspiring thing for me.
I was gonna say recently, I've had like two friends that I really talk to a lot and thinking about with my future, Whit being one of them. And then I have my friend Elliot, and he's been really helping me, especially thinking about moving into a different type of art that I've been working on with film and stuff, and helping me like with understanding the ways in which a different industry, because I was primarily working in music, and so now I'm working in film. And I feel like working in the film industry is like really different. And so like learning, I'm in film school, and having somebody who's really experienced in that and like communicating with me, and also being an advocate for the LGBT community, but specifically trans people, and wanting trans people to be successful. That's been really nice to like go back and forth with someone who transitioned and then is continuing to work. So that's been really fun.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. And I'll share this too, and it's kind of before my career, but I remember Star was like my trans fairy. Like, I don't know, I want to say like, when we met, I was like very non-binary, like I hadn't really committed to my transition. And I still identify as two-spirit, but like, I think that there was this way we talked about like the old school way of being trans, and I think this is like a really deep conversation within our own community with presentation and passability and gender non-conforming folks. And I think it's really important that we stay collective, but I think there's also some challenging intersections there. But the gift that you gave me was really understanding that taking the dive to like fully transition, own my masculinity and own my identity as a trans man, even if I felt like I'm two-spirit, is that meant that I got to be part of a movement that is so beautiful, and it also meant that I got to kind of uplift my trans sisters as the women that they are by claiming like my own masculinity, like in within the binary, as I say. And so that was like a political decision for me, right? It's like, if I'm comfortable with myself being a trans man, that means that I can be a good brother, uncle, whatever to trans women. And so I think that, I encourage other trans folks to come out and, not be afraid of the transition. And as much as it comes with the fight, like, you get to be a part of the fight, and you're not alone in that fight. And I'm just really grateful for you, because you really kind of helped me get to the other side of like my fear and my internalized transphobia. And that is what led to me having a career. So as far as like mentors, I've had various mentors, but I think that, I don't have a personal relationship with Miss Major, but like you said from the documentary, I remember once I decided to fully commit to transitioning, that being like medically, socially, all the ways, I started watching the documentaries, I started doing the research, and I think that most of my personal mentors are like the daughters of Miss Major, so they're like Black trans women in their 50s, I've already named some of them, but they all identify as daughters of Miss Major, and they really carry her legacy. So the legacy of transness, of trans family, of leading and fighting and being there for each other and taking each other into your home when they need to, or supporting each other financially when one person's down, like that was all taught to me through the legacy of Miss Major. And the work of TGIGP currently is working with the people at the bottom of that, because at this point, our community has like different scales of privilege. Like, we're lucky to have careers, but there's still those brothers and sisters that are in the street living in tents. And so it's interesting to me that you brought up the thing about Sylvia Rivera, because one of my friends who works for Glide, like, we'll talk about that and be like, everyone's talking about Sylvia and Marsha. I'm like, the girls are out there. Those are the same girls. They're out in the street. Like, if you want to learn, like, volunteer, go do outreach, again, get involved. Like, our community needs help, and we can't forget about those, because, just a few years ago, I was probably closer to their experience than I am now. I'm just very fortunate that because of this legacy and advocacy that was taught to me, I could kind of make my way up through peer-based models enough to become an advocate to kind of fall into the nonprofit sector through what I learned. But we can't leave our brothers and sisters who are still in the street behind in that process. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that also really, that sort of like care that happens with like, okay, you're like looking in the room and seeing like, okay, how can I like help someone in this room get access to what they need, and not only what they need to survive, but what they need to thrive and to, be the best version of themselves that they want to be. But also when you're thinking about workplaces of just like, yeah, how can you really invest in people's like well-being in a way that's authentic to them, in a way that is like respectful and caring. Like it really isn't that hard. And also if you don't know, you can ask. And if you have money, you can pay for that help. I think that right now maybe it's a good moment for us to just open it up for questions if people are thinking about some stuff. Yeah. Yes.
I have so many questions, but I'll just ask one. I'm Trisha Lagaso Goldberg. I'm part of the organizing team for Manifest Differently. Just want to say thank you so much for your labor, that you're performing and doing now, and of course, thank you to Marcel. So my husband David and I are parents to a non-binary child, and who's 20 years old, about to be 21, so an adult soon. As a woman of color, I often feel unsafe in white spaces, and so I really relate to like the stories that you're telling about like how do you know when to say something, right? Like that's kind of one of the questions that I often encounter, even as a professional who's successful in my career and blah blah blah. But that's a question, like how do you calculate that, like because there's a lot at risk, right? You could lose your job, you could lose respect, you could lose, I don't know, a promotion or something like this. So I just want to put that out there, not just for me, but for others in the room to kind of think through, like, where, it's not just about courage, it's about finding the right time, or, I don't know, how do you, each of you kind of calculate that for yourselves? Like, finding that moment where you need to speak up.
I think that's a really good question. I feel, also thank you so much for having us, Trisha and Megan and Veronica and the team. I'll just speak real quick on like what came to mind, which is that, I think we just saw it in some of these slides, right? It's like some people just decide not to even be out at all because they probably are seeing that given the context, it probably wouldn't be safe. And then there are like different moments, like I remember I had a working tech at some point, and I remember when everyone came out of leave from like maternity leave, like people would be like, oh my god, this person is back from maternity leave, like welcome this person, right? And everyone just writes comments. And I remember when I came back from top surgery, people were just like, oh, like welcome back. And I like told my manager, I was like, no, I want the message that says like, I came back from top surgery. I want people to know, and I want them to look it up if they don't know what it is. And it's not that everyone should do this, it just felt right for me to, because I was like, I'm excited, I feel like I have a new body. It feels as exciting as having a baby. Like, I want to celebrate that and I want to be open. But I also know that I was pushing buttons when I was there, right? And I had a temporary contract, so I knew it was gonna end at some point, right? But so I think about those moments where I'm like, oh, I could have been like, very in the DL, but to me, I was like, no, there's a lot of cis white people here, and I want them to look up top surgery, and I want them to know that I'm actually really proud about this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing and also for having us. I think that when assessing situations like that where you're finding an opportunity to speak up, I want to name that I don't believe that trans people have any kind of shortage of courage, and so I don't think that that is actually a problem. I think that what we do have a shortage of is power, and so looking at people in the room or outside of the room who are those power players, who you can take partnership with or even bring up your concern directly to, the way that you just describe going to your manager, and also understanding that like there is a lot at risk, and sometimes even naming that like that discomfort may be important. It may not happen in the exact situation where you feel like it may be necessary, and you may have to take it elsewhere. So I recognize that like while it's kind of shitty that the guy didn't offer to buy my lunch when he's asking me like how to parent better for his trans child, it was something where I was able to share an experience that was important to me about how I got clocked once because someone read my dead name on a receipt, and it led, in 2 months afterwards, we led an initiative to change, to choose chosen name without needing what is it? The legal document for the name change? Yeah, for Apple Pay. And so like, there can be other monumentous like moments that happen that are progressive, and you just need to find someone who does have that power and take the partnership with them. And I think that that's also like, that's probably more important when assessing a situation, because it can very easily seem like you just have to assess based on the opportunity for you to have the courage to speak at it. But the more impactful method would probably be to have someone else and, you know, reach across, which is very unfortunate that like the reality for queer people and for women and for people, you know, women of color, especially queer women of color, is that we don't have that power. So we need to find someone who does have that power and ask them to do that for us.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. I feel like recently this happened to me. It's happened twice. Once in the workplace and once at school. But in the workplace, I kind of was in the defense of my non-binary homie. Everybody at work was like refusing to call them they. This was like a decade ago, so I can understand it was like new for them. And I was like, y'all need to stop. I went off kind of crazy. But that's the doll way sometimes. I was like, you guys need to stop, like, leave them alone! I wouldn't do that again. These days, I would probably send a scathing email. But recently at school, we had to do this thing where we were all making a commercial together, and it was like all these military dudes, and I just felt like overwhelmed with the power dynamics of being with them. And so what I ended up doing was talking to the like executive producer, teacher person, and being like, honestly, you have to think about, and just talking about the optics of it and using that kind of language of like, look at how it looks. Like, these are like a bunch of dudes, and you have like me, and like, how am I supposed to yell at these people, or how is the power dynamic at play, and just like illuminating to people, because sometimes I don't think people consciously think about the way that it looks, like in a reality sense. I'm like, if a camera was here and we were to watch this back, and I use that kind of language, like if there was like, if this was recorded, what would this look like? And it would look kind of wild to have me fighting against these people, or to have me fighting against you, or to have me advocating for myself in like a violent way. So this is why I'm bringing this to your attention right now, because it would look weird. So can we talk about this? And like, that was how I was able to talk about it to him, because and he was like, wow, like, thank you for bringing this to my attention, because it would look crazy if I was yelling at these like military guys, and like, how would they react to me? And so in this conversation, he was like, oh, actually, yeah, you're right. Like, I'm gonna think about this and talk to these guys about how they talk to you and how they talk to other women in the program, because it was like, in film there's not a lot of women working in general, and then I'm like at the school there's all these military men specifically, so it's just the power dynamics are really weird. And so I just had to leverage the idea of what it actually looks like, and I think people really can get it when you talk in those terms.
Yeah, that's good, and thank you. It's helping me think of what I wanted to share. Yeah, so I feel like kind of both of you mentioned something that maybe I wanted to mention before, which is kind of a lot of the things that I'm also talking about, I want to say specifically impact trans folks of color, because even though all trans folks are, experience transphobia in the workplace and different barriers, I still have seen white folks that are trans and gender non-conforming kind of climb to the top when people of color don't. So I'm glad you brought up that intersection, because I really think that the barriers are specifically exacerbated by the intersection of transness and being a person of color. And I think, especially for women of color too. But this is a good opportunity for us to talk about this book. Because what I would say to you, and this is a huge tool that just came out, like, I don't think people understand how monumental this is, but this book was just published. So I think, to answer your question, what I would say is a lot of trans people wanting to speak up is maybe to check in with them privately, but not necessarily to like make us think about it. But maybe you go to the board and say, hey, what are our trans inclusive policies at the workplace? And kind of come at it from a more like general work policies and procedures. I was so grateful when I worked at the Bar Association that their HR training included that you can't misgender people. It was like part of the training. So this is like, I started reading this, it's beautifully written.
Yeah.
It's written just as any other book would be written professionally about like very standardized practices. So I think taking the attention away from the employee, because it takes off the kind of like the target on their back that they're already probably going to be dealing with. And also it means that they don't have to do the labor, and just going directly to the person in power, as Kenya said, and saying like, we need to be using these practices for best practice as an employer, and just keeping it that way. You know, that would be my suggestion anyway.
For sure. I think, yeah, so many of the data that we're looking at, this person analyzed, like AC folks, who has been doing a lot of consulting for a very long time, and also talks about his own experience in the workplace. So highly recommend this book.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Navi. I would still I'm early transition, I guess, and I feel oftentimes very messy. And when applying to things, I feel this struggle of communicating like who I am in an application, whether that's for school, whether that's for work. So much so that it's like, okay, then I'm just not gonna apply. So one question that I have is related to like suggestions for like navigating that kind of like these demands of all these institutions that are like, here, put yourself in a box and prove to us that you're good for this position. And linked to that, I'm looking for more places where I can like be with trans elders, and like just any suggestions for places that have been cool for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question.
I have one suggestion.
Recently, I went on Indeed, and they have an AI thing, and this is my only thing about AI that I'm really down for. You can be like, and this is actually a real suggestion to use, is to say, can you help me take I'm gonna give you my experiences, can you put this in a format for a resume or format for a CV, and it'll like do that for you, which is really helpful for me when I was trying to make my artistic CV. So like Indeed has a format, they do like where you put all your experiences in, and it'll like put it into the resume format, like in a nice, pretty way. But also ChatGPT will like do that for you as well, and so you can like make your resume there. So that's one option. Also, for me, something that I think about was like, I was like, oh, what are the different jobs I've done most recently? And so I used my experience being like, okay, social media, and I was like, I had AI help me make a cover letter to get a social media job, and I was like, could you help me get a social media job? Like, how would I talk about my work experience for social media? And then it like made it for me, and then I like edited it specifically to my work experience more towards like me. So that was a use of AI, and I feel like that I advocate highly for that, especially if you're like a person that's kind of scattered, like if you're saying that, or you have like a lot of multitudes or something. That's a tool to use to help coalesce all the information. And then also taking a piece of paper and like when they have the on the application, and it has each like descriptive thing of like, you need to have 5 years of experience of whatever, doing whatever, writing that like 5 years of experience doing this, and then start making a list of the things that you've done on a piece of paper that are that experience, and then putting that into like your resume of like, oh, what is the job or what are the things I've done, and just like making a list of the things that fit the description, each description line, and that just helps you think about it when you start going to multiple applications.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. So a couple of transit organizations that you could probably start just seeing if you can sign up as a volunteer. They might not have open positions, or but definitely volunteering, because there's always a need for that. Is Transgender Intersex Justice Project is one I mentioned. There's the Transgender District. There's also now the shelter. So trying to get involved with volunteering is a good way to like meet people, and then from there, you get to know them. Just maybe you'll get a chance to like have lunch or something, but just building those relationships by being helpful, and just being around, you know, showing up to the things. And I will say, like, not everybody feels this way. Early stages of transitioning for me were extremely uncomfortable and extremely difficult, because that's the stage in which socially transitioning is extremely disorienting. So just hang on, because I know how that feels and I've been talking about it. And unfortunately, second wave feminism is still very alive in the queer community. I feel that way, and it was really, you know, a challenging time. So that's when, you know, I think, you know, really sticking to other trans folks that have been through early stages of transition, and know what that feels like. And just at the end of the day, like, we have to have each other's backs, and there has to be spaces that are just for us for exactly that reason. So, I mean, I know that I have friends that going to support groups for folks that are transitioning have gotten a lot out of that. But, you know, hang in there and just be around your people and try to I started with volunteering and, you know, just being like, honestly, for the first, like, probably 2 years, I just was like, let me get the coffee, you know what I mean? I was just like running around, like doing whatever I could just to be around my elders. And from there I grew, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, thank you for coming. I think that I also wanted to say, oh, I was just gonna say something on last one. But no, I was just gonna say that I think that that's a very vulnerable place to be. I feel I transitioned while I was in a job, so I kind of had those moments where I was like, okay, now I have to ask everyone to call me something different, and I'm gonna start using different bathrooms. And I think at the end of the day, I think that surrounding myself by people who like got that experience, so that if I experience something weird, I could just like let it out. But also, if you're thinking of applying for jobs, I feel like applying to like trans organizations, but you know, surrounding yourself in a supportive environment might be very helpful. I think we have time for one more question. So.
Just a comment, and this is coming, you know, from the privilege of being a father to a non-binary kid. But I also work in the corporate environment, and it's been really kind of heartbreaking to see, just as inclusion in general is downsized and de-emphasized, that it's also on us as non-trans people to advocate for trans people. So you have to talk to your HR people and just ask, like, how are you supporting this community? Because oftentimes that percentage that does not announce themselves, we have to be there to assume that there could be people that are trans that you just don't know, right? Whether that's by their choice or by them feeling safe or by them passing, right? It's like, we don't know, so it's on us in the same way that we're supposed to think about disabled folk, people of color, like, and this is where our tools as sort of Californian woke folk can actually help, because yes, there's things that are specific to trans issues, but a lot of this stuff is intersectional, right? So don't be afraid to like use what you know about how you advocated for other groups for trans people as well, because like if we don't do it, these corporations will they'll just let it cruise. Like when Disney downsized and they took out, you know, feminine care stuff from both bathrooms, and it was a beautiful thing to see that, like, you didn't know, but it was there. And then when Disney stopped spending money, they pull all that stuff. Excuse me, I'm getting kind of. It just hurts, right? And I recognize that was on me to start talking to my managers, right? And just asking, not even like throwing a fist up, just being like, what happened to this? You know what I mean? And the other thing, and I'm really not trying to make it about me, but one thing that helped was joining other employee resource groups. So joining the Native American group, joining the veterans, right? And I'm encouraging trans folks to join those too, because you actually find people that are fighting similar struggles, because this is the same machine running underneath all this stuff, right? It's the same code.
Yeah, and I think
Thank you.
another thing, yeah, totally. I think that another thing was just like, if you're having an interview, to ask employees like, okay, how do you support your trans employees? Like, what things do you have on paper that support that? I think we're gonna end it there.
Your t-shirts.
Oh yeah, we're selling t-shirts, hire trans folks. They're on the table, they're $30, half of the proceeds go to the Transgender district. And thank you so much for coming, you all. We're gonna be around and mingling and eating, so thank you so much and thank you.